Chapter 10. After High School Part 3, Fall Term 2013 and Spring Term 2014. The fall of 2013, Music in the Book. In early November, I uploaded 18 songs on YouTube as well as this book for the first time. I started working on the book after leaving my parents' house, but the idea of using music for promotion didn't come up until the spring of 2013. The song, Blotzen, based on Block 44's, Cashin, with its catchy chorus became a huge hit and I became somewhat of a local rap star in Umeå. I didn't expect that to become such a big deal. In my eyes, the book was the main focus, but yet it didn't start getting too much attention until perhaps 2019. In today's retrospect, I'm only glad for that since I've realized I shouldn't have written exactly everything I wrote back in the day. I've rewritten the book a number of times, but it wasn't until November 2015 that the book ever became suitable for publishing at all. Actually, I could have published the book much earlier, since it was practically finished in 2010 already. I never had to write down so much and then publish it all in November 2013. I could have published a little more gradually with the time like I did later from here on. The same goes for the music. I could blame it on letting Alex Jones make me paranoid about the world/internet going under, which could happen anytime soon, probably during 2014 already. That in combo with my previous living made me develop some kind of quote, plunging airplane, mentality. That also affected how the courthouse affected me. On top of the fact that I could have found the courthouse back in high school already, and thus gone through all the cases from those years during those years, instead of dumping all of them on myself during this year alone like a falling piano, I also quote, had to finish all of them during this year alone before releasing the music in the book, instead of spreading it all out and doing a little less at a time but yet more on the side in the long run. I also believed seriously that the cases made up of about 90% of all crimes ever committed, but nowadays I can assure you it was only about half. Regarding the blunts, cannabis that is, in this case minor possession of narcotics, the most unnecessary burden on the justice system, I believed the same, but now I know that it's only about 10%, even regarding those who've been caught the most often, like 10 times. I saw quite a lot both during high school and the years after that never entered the courthouse anyway. I was given way too much empty time during my first year after high school. Now everything suddenly got so tight and stressful. Fortunately, the next year got a little more loose since I got more or less finished with everything and some other stuff which made me somewhat less dependent on Alex Jones, plus the courthouse since now I was reading only a little at a time, new cases once/twice a week. But to then waste even more time, I made a number of anonymous Wikipedia-like videos about Sweden and its hood/hip-hop culture in English in order to get more views. I couldn't just settle with the music. Now I see clearly that I made myself look like a Swedish patriot racist, like a Sweden Democrats supporter. Talk about attracting the right kind of viewers, to be ironic. And I also didn't have the same substance in my voice as only the year later. But perhaps it was a little better than text-to-speech. Now when I look back, I feel like the music became utterly empty, pathetic and without substance considering my overall life the previous and the coming year. I would like to have given myself more time for preparation and development and perhaps started everything the way I did it the next fall, which for the most part got way better. But of course even this too early release gave me some freedom, from Alex Jones among other things, and additional experience, like some other things that weren't too good. I also started walking around downtown on the weekend nights this fall, which gave me good results. I often bumped into people and I even got stuck at one or another restaurant quite often. During the 2 previous falls and winters, I just walked around an old school for about 30 to 60 minutes trying to reminisce, digging through the past. I spent 3 nights at Brentus, Bergumskolan, Olymskolan, Ustra and Torren. I believed I had nowhere else to go on the weekends, perhaps because it was so empty on the school/work days. But now I'd gotten tired of doing so, much because I felt overall better, which in turn made me feel even more better as I changed ways. During the fall of 2010, I came up with the idea of taking the bike downtown and then the bus to the hood to take a walk around there and then go the same way back home. Yet I usually bumped into people downtown, which happened quite often actually. The hood was pretty much always empty. That's how I came up with the idea of walking around downtown on the weekend nights. I can't explain why I didn't do that the previous falls and winters. I could have easily combined it with hanging at the school in question on the Saturday or Sunday noon. I also started staying at home the entire evening and night on the school/work days this fall. Since then, I've hardly ever been outdoors on the work/school days during the fall and winter. I'd realized it was just a waste of time. Lately, I've realized my mistake by hardly ever going out on the school day evenings during the springs before graduating high school. I can easily blame it on being at school all day, unlike now when I usually got home at 12 already. I did have the strength to take the bike around the entire city during the summer holidays, and I did that quite often in the middle of the day any time of the year, since I often finished school early and had long enough recesses long after lunchtime. I don't think living in the hood would have helped much during the other seasons. In fact, it only would have added to much more guilt. I've realized that even more since I left my parents' house. 2014. The Kush and the Quran. On New Year's Day I asked some older/same-aged homies if they had cannabis. After having studied the war on drugs during the last year, I'd recently considered trying cannabis. I was stupid for asking people about it on Facebook, even in private chat. It could be dangerous enough just by making a phone call. I got some offers, but waited. About a week later, I asked a few guys at Dragon in physical presence like supposed to, and then I got a deal. During this month, I had no place to go to, so I could easily go to Dragon every day. I asked the guy in question a number of questions regarding cannabis, how to hide it, dosage, price, etc. Then we finally decided a time and place. I met him and some other guys someplace one night and bought 1.5 gram green marijuana for 300 crowns, about $42 to $50. Then, on the Friday of February 7th, I got high for the first time. But I didn't smoke it, and I never have. I made small cookies out of it, with about 30 grams flour, right above an ounce, 30 milliliters milk, 5 grams cacao and some other things. Of course I experimented a little with the ingredients. I divided the grass the best I could in 5 equal parts to get 0.3 gram. Then I mixed it into the dough, put it in the oven and ate it directly after dinner and started getting high about 1-2 hours after eating it. Then I was high for about 8 to 12 hours. In the meantime I usually sat in front of the computer listening to music. Mainly Swedish hip-hop, but also some American, mostly about cannabis of course. I got euphoric and laughed a lot during the first 3 hours, but then I started getting tired of it, getting low if you will, and wanted to get sober again. I started getting paralyzed, unable to move, and wanted to be free. I couldn't enjoy it anymore. It could take about half an hour just to switch song, plus an hour just to go to bed, and of course I had to do it without having taken a shower, and I always shower before going to bed. Then I remained real slow when waking up and didn't get truly sober until perhaps after lunch or even dinner. But then when I went out at night, I got real cocky. Then in the long run I became somewhat more emotionally intense, more happy, more sad, more angry, more alive simply. The cockiness probably came a lot from being automatically criminal, which I became due to the book already, after all that happened in 2010, and then having the stuff at home and in my urine. It only stays in the blood for 24 hours, in the urine for about 2 months. My newly started rap career surely played its role in all of this also. Then it also was that the weed and my recently strengthened relationship to hip-hop became a small but significant liberation from Alex Jones. As much as I still streamed him, I really needed these breaks from him. But it was nothing compared to all that happened when I cut him off altogether, but that didn't make me quit the weed right away. Then the weed took too much space. It became both more and less significant. During late January, I borrowed the Quran from the library after having considered it for some time. Back in these days, I found it hard to understand and also repetitive. I thought then it was for the most part about sins and forgiveness, heaven and hell. It said a few times clearly that you can't eat pork. I couldn't possibly build myself a perception of Islam through the Quran alone, and I couldn't possibly call myself a full-fledged Muslim right after having read it. I read it mainly just for the sake of it, because I felt like I owed myself to do it. But surely I got something out of it. After having read it, I told my parents to stop serving me pork on Sundays. I had actually eaten it like once a month since I quit eating it otherwise, but now I quit it for real. I also got 35 likes when uploading a picture of the Quran on Facebook. I pondered a little upon what God thought of me using cannabis. I thought of a few Muslim lectures that had said clearly that it was haram, but then I thought of everything else that gets wrongly labeled haram like music. Now I had to choose between either that or all the scientific information about the war on drugs and medicinal cannabis. What do you think I chose? Regarding hip-hop, there were always two sides of that coin regarding its message on cannabis, so that was utterly irrelevant to my choice to begin with. It only came as a huge bonus once I started using. I made my second cookie on the Good Friday of April 18th, when I thought the streets were empty, which I doubt these days. Otherwise, I always made the cookie on Fridays, with a few exceptions, when the weather was ugly enough for me to not go out. At the most dense, I hit it every 3 weeks, but sometimes I waited more than 2 months. I never did it on Saturdays since I wanted to be sure I was completely sober, or better yet sober enough, when having dinner at my mom's or pop's house on Sundays. Then in July, in the middle of Ramadan I might add, I bought my second joint, this time 2.5 grams dark brown hash for 500 crowns, about 71 to 83 US dollars. Knowing that hash is much heavier than marijuana, I took only 0.25 gram the first few times and then I went down to 0.2. I was quite quick to notice the difference from the grass. Not only did I get higher, and then lower, but I also got somewhat more severely intoxicated, twisted. One of the guys in question said he had tried a similar joint previously and said these was spice, also known as K2, in it, so I got a good warning right there. He could have actually lost a customer and a 500 crown bill, and it ain't impossible there was something else in this joint. Much more likely than the first one, put aside the basic difference between hash and marijuana. But anyway, I kept going proudly. I also might add that one night in the hood during the fall of 2015, when acting somewhat intoxicated, a guy said, "That's mushrooms, psychedelic mushrooms that is." That ain't impossible neither, because I know thanks to the courthouse that some people have been using it. 2014. The Cops. On the Friday of April 4th, I was at 5 when reggae artist General Kenaz was gonna perform there. While waiting for him, I became quite bored since there was hardly anyone I knew. I decided to leave right after General Kenaz was finished performing. But then right after midnight, right before he came up, I was to my surprise grabbed in the arm by an undercover cop. He brought me to a room right next to the entrance and asked me some questions. I got to show him my ID and then he called the station, probably to check if my name could be found in the crime register or if I was the right guy, like they say. Then I got to look at a moving pen without moving my head. Then he dug through my pockets and then a guard gave him my jacket so he could dig through that. I asked why he grabbed me and then he said I looked suspicious for walking around alone doing practically nothing. I told him I was waiting for General Kenaz and that there are usually plenty of people I know at 5, but hardly any just for tonight. Then he asked me about the people, mainly racialized of course, I'd been talking to earlier that night and how I got to know them. I told him I've bumped into people now and then along the way, without giving out names and any details about how I got to know him or him. Then when he dug through my pockets, he found a self-defense spray that I bought illegally at the Technique magazine, a small store downtown where you can find all kinds of technical stuff. I found it sometime during the last fall. I started considering buying the spray, which cost only 170 crowns, about $25 to $30, and then a few weeks later, I finally bought it. My first reason for buying it was that I wanted to carry a non-lethal weapon, legally. I saw it as a great alternative for knives, batons and baseball bats. This weapon would deal out minimal physical damage and could easily be hidden in a small pocket. My second reason was I had experienced a number of quite threatening situations with the frassers during the last 2-3 years where the spray could have been to good use maybe. My third reason was that since I'd put out my music in this book, I wanted to be able to defend myself just in case someone would come after me for everything I'd written about those girls. Those threatening situations had nothing to do with the music or book though. Then it was also that I knew a number of guys who had been convicted of gun possession. Of course I took the opportunity to follow the trend without having to break the law or hurt anyone. Alex Jones and his gun talk had also had a huge influence on me, not that I necessarily agreed that everyone should be legally armed. Nowadays, however, that's become a much more relevant discussion here in Sweden due to all these gang shootings since 2015. I had also recently read an article about a woman in Umeå who defended herself against a robber with a similar spray, if not the same one. I thought to myself I could have one as well. Later I got to read about the case in the courthouse, which didn't involve anyone I knew. When the cop found the spray, things immediately got worse. Now he started questioning why I had the spray and also why I walked around in the club with it. I told him I had weak fists, which I've had my whole life to this day, and that I also had experienced quite some threatening situations. There was another cop present, in a uniform. I think he showed up after the undercover cop found the spray. At least he wasn't there from the start. The whole thing resulted in them confiscating the spray and kicking me out. The cop gave me his name, without me asking for it, and also told me I could request the spray back. When I first left, I just felt relieved things didn't get worse. But soon after, I got bitter that I got grabbed for no reason and then disarmed and kicked out. I also wonder what went through his mind when he decided to grab me out of all people, a white guy with no crime record who hadn't had a drop of alcohol and who hadn't argued with anyone. I remember the cop with the uniform telling me, "You shouldn't have that, the spray that is." At first I didn't care since I just wanted to leave unhurt. But after the incident, I slowly started to have a grudge against these two cops, but not all cops collectively. I started to understand even more why minorities hate cops, now when they get grabbed regularly without probable cause. I was immediately worried I would get grabbed again soon. I also became afraid of walking around armed, despite it being legal and all. The next day, I bought the same spray at the Technique magazine. I never minded getting back the old one since I didn't want to draw attention from the cops, and thus increase the risk of getting stopped and searched again. I also didn't want to go like an entire week unarmed. I did stop having the spray at the club though, as unnecessary and risky as that was. I realized the spray did have its cons after all, despite it being legal. Now I've realized I was retarded for walking around the club with it in the pocket when I just as easily could have left it in the jacket. That would have helped especially now when I got searched, even if there still could have been consequences. Exactly the same day, I saw the cop in the uniform, fully armed and everything, which made me even angrier. I thought here we had a cop walking around with a sharp loaded lead bullet gun in broad daylight, while I couldn't have a non-lethal, legal weapon at the club, and thus on my way home after midnight and all. And even if I certainly was retarded for having the spray in my pocket inside the club, I thought this cop was real hypocritical for walking around with a gun in broad daylight after having said, "You shouldn't have that." I remember the undercover cop telling me I could overreact by pulling out the spray unnecessarily and thus get convicted just like the other guy involved. He also said it could cause eye damage. Well, you can also get convicted for punching somebody, and you could also cause just as much damage with your fists, maybe not in my case though. You're also legally allowed to defend yourself, with or without the spray, just as long as you don't take it too far. And how often don't cops take it too far, or even get violent at all when there's no reason whatsoever for it? How often don't cops shoot people unnecessarily? It don't happen as much in the States as we've been made to believe it does, but it's happened a few times here in Sweden also, and a bit more often in more recent years. He also told me something about acting gangsta. Well, how much didn't the guy himself act gangsta by walking around with a gun and also dressing like a criminal? He also told me he had a quote, better spray. Well, I assume it's illegal for ordinary citizens to have that. Maybe that's why it's better, just because it's more damaging. In other words, he's a total hypocrite. Everything he told me about me fit him a whole lot better. Talk about backfire. I might add I was wearing a t-shirt portraying rapper Knack that night. I got it from a friend shortly after Knack performed at 5 on the Friday of October 25, 2013. I had had that t-shirt every night at the club since then. That in combination with General Kenaz performing could have led to me being grabbed, since both artists rap/sing a whole lot about cannabis. Consequently, I stopped wearing that shirt after that night. I also realized I was weird for wearing it now when Knack wasn't the one performing. As I see it, this seems to be the type that really likes to arrest people for small amounts of drugs only to get a large amount of arrests, and thus one or another salary bonus. He was real aggressive and provocative despite me being totally calm. A real bully in other words. The few times I'd been stopped by cops otherwise, they'd never been any more aggressive and provocative than me, and they only checked my ID for a minute. Only once since this have I been searched. That happened right outside the Oldham Mall one workday evening in the spring of 2016. That's also how our twisted drug policies work. Cops who chase real criminals, including those who traffic and sell large amounts, get much fewer arrests than those who chase people only for having small amounts, often for personal use. That means that those who chase small amounts are undeservedly more successful in their careers. Well, this cop got nothing out of grabbing me. He got no drugs, no illegal weapon, thus no arrest. I also might add that the Technique magazine, and thus even the spray manufacturers, earned $25 to $30 extra since I had to buy a new one, while this cop didn't earn 1 cent. He actually added financially to those that manufactured the weapon he took from me. Talk about backfire. It helps to think about it since I lost that money, not that it's such a big deal anyway. I know people who've been caught with illegal weapons and lost thousands of crowns, hundreds of dollars, perhaps even done some time in prison for it. Quite shortly after the incident, I happened to watch a news coverage on TV about cops looking for drugs in the clubs. The reportage also said that the youth has become more, quote, drug liberal. My jaw dropped when I saw a short interview with this undercover cop that grabbed me at 5, this time in a uniform in the driver's seat. Later I saw a coverage about Nazis practicing with knives in the woods around Umeå, and that the cops allowed it since it was legal to carry knives in the woods. Of course it's okay if you're only out to pick mushrooms or berries, but that wasn't the case here. These Nazis, hardcore violent criminals, were allowed to practice with knives in the woods without a problem, like they weren't gonna use them illegally later. By the way, downtown was illegally invaded by Nazis in broad daylight on a Saturday during September 2013. I happened to be right there. What's a guy with no record walking around the club legally armed compared to that? Sure, I should have left it in the jacket in the closet. Maybe that would have made a difference. My newborn hatred for cops got even worse on Walpurgis, the Thursday of May 1st, when SVP, the Swedes Party, an independent Nazi political party, marched through Jönköping in the south of Sweden, this time with police protection. Here we had straight-up Nazis marching through a city with police protection, while non-violent protesters got arrested or attacked by the Nazis without the cops interfering. I and many others had never seen anything like this before in Sweden. Sometimes when I've been out at night, I've seen racialized guys behaving provocatively towards cops. One time, a guy walked right behind 2 cops. Another time, a guy screamed, "Fuck the police," right when a cop car rolled by. Another time, a guy grabbed a cop by the shoulder from behind. Funnily, those cops did absolutely nothing in response. At the time, I just thought what these guys did was vain and that they were just putting themselves at risk unnecessarily. But now after what happened to me at 5, I could understand them a little. I can only imagine what they've experienced, since what happened to me only represents perhaps 5–10% of their experience. That undercover cop should have also seen me at Krugen back in 10th grade, or other club nights when much more controversial artists, Kartellen, Labyrinth, Ken Ring etc., performed, or all these spring and summer evenings out in the hood. I can promise I was behaving a lot more, quote, suspiciously, those times, with or without the spray. But yet nothing happened to me. I can safely laugh at him for that. I'd also like to compare him to his colleagues who did absolutely nothing while being severely provoked by these racialized guys, while this cop was so hard on me even before finding the spray. How do you think he would have handled these guys? It's also real unnecessary being armed inside the club since it's packed with people and plenty of guards. You also draw suspicion obviously just for being armed, legally or not, out or indoors. I don't quite blame this undercover cop just for that, even if he at first had no reason to suspect I had a weapon, and even very few reasons to suspect I had cannabis. As badly addicted to Alex Jones as I was at this point, after the life before YMCA and Dragon, I behaved honestly a little bit like a cop myself, quite like Denzel Washington in Training Day. But this incident made me somewhat more independent from him, quite like the weed. The same night I got kicked out, I listened to all the anti-cop music I could think of at home, quite like all the weed music I could think of when getting high. 3 times later during 2014, when going to the club, I took the spray with me all the way, almost. I parked the bike a bit more distant than usual, put the spray in a small plastic bag and locked it onto the bike. I'd rather have some random thief snatch the spray outside the club than a cop doing it and having me kicked out at the same time. For a long time, I let myself be convinced by Alex Jones that everything would be better if all of us had guns legally. I also remember a gun amnesty in Sweden during the spring of 2013, when people were able to turn their guns in for a short period without getting convicted. I pointed out that only law-abiding citizens would turn their guns in while criminals who had guns would keep theirs. I was totally right about that, and then we saw that again in 2018 during the next amnesty in the new Sweden. It was mainly old people, including my paternal grandfather, who turned in their late parents' old rifles, which he did in 2013. I wonder if that really did anything to fight crime, let alone all the gun crime in the major cities in Sweden both then and now. Doubt it. But then during 2014, before quitting Alex Jones, I realized that everything wouldn't necessarily be better if everybody had guns, even though Alex Jones has always had strong arguments for gun rights. Guns have their pros and cons. Some people are fully fit to carry guns, and some not at all. But that includes a lot of, if not most, cops, let alone this one. There are countries where cops have no guns, which make them a much lesser threat to ordinary citizens, which in turn makes the citizens feel less threatened by the cops. It's only right considering the fact that cops hardly ever need guns in many countries, and that they too often use them unnecessarily. Why couldn't cops in Sweden go without guns before 2015 at least? Wasn't a baton and a spray, yeah they could have that, good enough? Personally, I would have rather seen cops disarmed than the entire population armed back in the day. Due to today's climate, we all might need weapons legally much more nowadays. We can discuss that, let alone our politicians. Later during the spring and summer of 2014, I researched a lot about how to handle police encounters. I found these two videos among others titled, Busted, The Citizen's Guide to Surviving Police Encounters, and 10 Rules for Dealing with Police. I did however find very little information about how to handle police encounters in Sweden. Not even as of December 2022 have I learned whether or not I have the right to say, I don't consent to a search in Sweden. Then it's obviously much harder and more risky for blacks and Latinos in the US to try to exercise their legal rights with the police. That's when I also found the book titled Opposition, a handbook in understanding the game of the law, in Swedish, which you can find right here at my own website fsgumea.weebly.com. Nowadays there's obviously more information about one's rights in Sweden, let alone the YouTube channel Advokat Snack, Lawyer Talk.